The dark secrets of Zhao Wei and her husband, exposing their twisted crimes. A hook. What if everything you believed about your life was a lie? A celebrity's dark secret betrayal, and a game she never knew she was playing. Zhao Wei thought she could escape, but the truth was far worse than she ever imagined. Watch till the end to find out how deep the darkness goes. The night was colder than usual. The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the windows of the grand mansion. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Not a single sound broke the stillness, except for the soft ticking of an ancient clock on the wall. Zhao Wei stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't blink. The cold air seemed to seep into her bones, though she hardly noticed. Her mind was elsewhere. Her husband, the elusive businessman, had been acting strangely. His eyes darted to shadows when he thought no one was looking. His hands trembled slightly when he held a glass of wine. The mansion was too quiet. Zhao Wei's fingers brushed against the cold, glass surface. She could feel her heartbeat quicken. Something was wrong. Her eyes moved toward the study at the end of the hall. She could just make out the dim light beneath the door. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her heart pounded as she slowly approached the study. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Her husband was sitting at the desk, hunched over a stack of papers. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. "Why are you up so late?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer. The silence in the room grew thicker. The air felt heavier, as though something was pressing down on her chest. Zhao Wei's eyes drifted to the papers on the desk. There were strange symbols, codes she didn't understand. Suddenly, her husband's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising force. His grip tightened. "You shouldn't have seen this," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. Zhao Wei's pulse raced as she tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened further. A loud thud echoed through the house. The door slammed shut behind her. Her mind raced. Something dark was unfolding, something far worse than she could have imagined. She couldn't escape now, her breath caught in her throat. The air seemed to freeze around her, thick with dread. Her husband's grip remained unyielding, cold as steel. She struggled, but it felt as if the very walls were pressing in on her, trapping her in this nightmare. "Let me go," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. But he didn't release her. Instead, his eyes, those familiar eyes, seemed to darken further, as if some hidden side of him had surfaced. He slowly stood, his fingers still wrapped tightly around her wrist. His movements were stiff, deliberate. "Zhao Wei," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Her pulse raced as she tried to make sense of his words, his eerie calmness. Her mind raced through memories, his sudden wealth, their secretive life together, his long nights away. Nothing seemed to add up anymore. The room around them seemed to close in. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, as though the house itself was alive, watching them. The dim light from the desk lamp flickered. "Why are you doing this?" Zhao Wei whispered, her voice barely audible. Her husband's lips curled into a chilling smile. "You never asked the right questions," he said softly, his grip still tight. "Now you know too much." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She glanced around, desperate to find a way out, but the study felt like a prison. Suddenly, her eyes locked onto the papers on the desk again. One stood out, its edges slightly burned, the symbols written in red ink. Her husband seemed to notice her gaze, and his smile widened. "They were never meant for you," he muttered. Zhao Wei's chest tightened as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about money or power. This was something darker, something far worse. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. In that moment, she heard a faint sound. The soft creak of the door behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. There was someone else in the house. Someone watching. Her husband turned sharply. But it was too late. The trap had already been set. Her husband's eyes flickered to the door, a sudden shift in his expression. The once calm demeanor faded, replaced by an edge of panic. Zhao Wei tried to move, but his grip tightened like a vice. She could feel his pulse thumping through his hand, each beat quick and erratic. The creak grew louder, closer. A soft shuffle echoed in the hallway. Then silence. Zhao Wei's heart raced in her chest, her breath shallow. The oppressive stillness made her skin crawl. Her husband's grip loosened slightly. She saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by something darker. He turned, looking toward the shadows that had gathered at the door. The sound came again, closer now. The soft click of footsteps, too light, too deliberate. Zhao Wei dared to glance over her shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder, but the hallway was empty. Only the flickering light from the study lamp cast long, unsettling shadows against the walls. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She needed to get away, now. But her husband wasn't done. With a low growl, he yanked her forward, pulling her away from the door. "You're not leaving," he hissed. Zhao Wei stumbled, barely catching herself. The door was now ajar, and she could feel the heavy weight of something, or someone, lurking just beyond the threshold. Her mind spun, her body frozen in terror. Then, just as quickly as the moment began, it ended. A shadow darted into the room, too fast for her to register. And before she could react, the air was thick with the scent of something metallic, sharp, blood. Her husband's grip faltered. Zhao Wei turned in a blur of movement, her eyes wide with shock. The figure that emerged from the shadows was neither man nor woman, but something in between. Pale, gaunt features stared back at her, void of emotion. The intruder moved toward her husband without hesitation. Her husband's face twisted with a mix of fear and rage as the figure approached. What have you done?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The intruder's lips parted in a silent sneer. Without another word, they reached for her husband. A flash of steel, then nothing. Her husband crumpled to the floor, his body falling with a sickening thud. Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure turned to her, their eyes locked. A chill ran down her spine as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about her husband. It was about her, too. And now, she was trapped. The figure took a step forward, their gaze never leaving Zhao Wei's trembling form. She could feel the weight of their presence, cold and suffocating. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath ragged and shallow. She backed away, but the wall pressed against her back, a dead end. The figure was closer now. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, like they were gliding across the floor. Zhao Wei's mind raced. She needed to act. She needed to get out. But her body felt paralyzed, as if the air itself was holding her in place. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, waiting for something. Then it spoke. "We've been watching you." The voice was low, almost a whisper. "You were never meant to discover the truth." Zhao Wei's stomach churned. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. "You think you're innocent, don't you?" The figure continued, its tone dripping with mockery. "But you're just as guilty as he was." She shook her head, confusion and fear clouding her mind. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. "What do you mean?" Her voice cracked, barely audible. The figure's eyes narrowed, lips curling into a twisted smile. "Your husband was never the mastermind," it whispered. "He was just a pawn, a puppet. And now, so are you?" Her body trembled, the weight of its words sinking in. She looked back at her husband's lifeless body, the blood pooling beneath him. Her thoughts swirled. Was he really the monster she believed him to be? Or had he been led down this path by someone far worse? The figure moved again, faster this time, closing the distance between them. "You never asked the right questions," it murmured, as it reached into the folds of its cloak. "And now it's too late." A sharp, cold object emerged from the shadows of its cloak. A knife, gleaming in the dim light. Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't think. She had to run. With a sudden burst of energy, she darted to the side. But the figure was faster. A cold hand wrapped around her arm, pulling her back with terrifying strength. "You can't escape," it said, its voice cold and final. Her pulse raced as she tried to break free, but the grip was unyielding. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't know how much longer she could fight. The figure leaned in close, its breath icy against her ear. "You should have stayed out of it," it whispered. "Now you'll join him." The knife gleamed in the dim light. And then everything went black. The darkness consumed her in an instant, swallowing her entire world. Zhao Wei's body felt numb, her limbs unresponsive. A deep, suffocating silence wrapped around her, thick and oppressive. Her mind struggled to stay awake, to fight against the pull of unconsciousness. But the weight of her exhaustion was too much. She couldn't remember how long she had been out, minutes, hours, days. Her senses slowly began to return. The cold stone beneath her fingers, the sharp, acrid scent of blood in the air. She groaned, trying to lift her head, but it felt like 1,000 pounds. Her eyelids fluttered open. The room around her was dim, barely lit by a single flickering light. Her body was cold, shivering uncontrollably. She felt a dull ache in her chest, as if her heart was being squeezed. Zhao Wei's eyes moved slowly, taking in her surroundings. She was no longer in the study. She was in a dark, damp room, the walls closing in around her. The faintest sliver of moonlight filtered through a small window high above. Her hands were bound to a chair, the ropes digging into her skin, cutting off circulation. Panic surged through her. She struggled, but the ropes only tightened. Then she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She froze. The figure emerged from the shadows, its face hidden beneath the hood. "You're awake," it said, its voice a low rasp, void of emotion. Zhao Wei's pulse quickened. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a mere whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure took a step closer, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You've been asking too many questions," it said. "Questions that were never meant for you." Zhao Wei's mind spun. This wasn't the end. She wasn't dead, not yet. "Why?" she choked out. "Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted its head, studying her with a dark, knowing gaze. "Because," it began, the words stretching out like poison. "You were never meant to see the truth, and now you will become part of it." Her breath quickened as she tried to make sense of its cryptic words. The figure stepped forward, its hand reaching out slowly, almost tenderly, as though savoring the moment. Zhao Wei's heart pounded in her ears. This was it. She had no more escape, no more time. Her pulse raced as her mind raced, with thoughts of how to survive. And then, just as the figure's hand reached her face, a sudden, loud crash sounded from the doorway. The figure froze. Zhao Wei's eyes widened. Another shadow moved in the doorway, another figure. She didn't know who or what it was, but in that moment, it was her only chance. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, blocking the only exit. Zhao Wei's heart skipped a beat, but she couldn't tell if this new presence was friend or foe. The shadow moved with purpose, the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered. His presence filled the room, cutting through the tension. The hooded figure hesitated. Its eyes flickered between Zhao Wei and the newcomer. A tense silence stretched between them. The new figure spoke, his voice deep and commanding, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Let her go." Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat. The voice, she knew it. It was familiar, like a long-lost memory surfacing. The hooded figure stepped back slightly, still watching Zhao Wei with those cold, calculating eyes. "No one tells me what to do," it hissed. But the newcomer wasn't backing down. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the figure. The tension in the room was palpable, as if every breath could be the last. Then, without warning, the hooded figure lunged forward, its hand reaching out with a flash of silver and knife. Zhao Wei's body tensed, the world slowing down around her. But the man in the doorway reacted faster. In one fluid motion, he intercepted the blade with his own, the clash of steel echoing in the room. Zhao Wei gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. Was this some kind of rescue? The man's face remained unreadable, his expression hardened with purpose. His movements were calculated, precise, as if he had been here before. The two figures struggled, their movements a blur of dark shadows, the clashing of blades ringing out in the cold, silent room. Zhao Wei's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What did he want? Was he there to help her or to finish the job her husband's dark secrets had started? The fight between them grew more intense, the figure in the hood clearly skilled. But the man in the doorway was relentless. He fought with a ferocity that told Zhao Wei this wasn't the first time he had been in a battle like this. Then, in a flash, the man disarmed the figure. The hooded figure stumbled back, its eyes flashing with fury, but it was too late. The man took a step forward, his voice low and steady. "This ends now." The figure in the hood dropped its knife, its gaze filled with hate and something else, fear. Zhao Wei couldn't take her eyes off them. Her heart thudded in her chest. Was this truly the end? Or had she just stepped into another nightmare? The room was thick with tension, the silence ringing louder than the fight that had just ended. The hooded figure stood frozen, its breathing labored. It glanced at Zhao Wei, then back at the man in the doorway, eyes filled with something like desperation. "You don't understand," it rasped, voice trembling. "You don't remember, do you?" he said, almost to himself. "The things you've seen, the people you've crossed paths with." Zhao Wei frowned. "What are you talking about?" The man's gaze flicked to her then, his eyes sharp, with something darker than just concern. "You were never supposed to know. Your husband's involvement, everything he was hiding. You were supposed to stay in the dark." Her pulse raced. "My husband? What do you mean?" The man finally looked at her fully, his expression hard. But there was something almost sympathetic in his gaze. "You think you were living a normal life. That's the way they wanted it. But you got too close to the truth. And now you're a target. We both are." Zhao Wei's heart pounded, and for the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about the figure. It wasn't even just about her husband's death. It was something far bigger, something much darker. She turned to him, eyes wide. "Who are they? And what's my husband's role in this?" The man's face darkened, his grip tightening even further on the wheel. "They were using him, using both of you." The weight of his words sank in, and Zhao Wei's breath caught. "Using us for what?" The man glanced at her again, his expression unreadable. "That's what we need to find out. But first, we need to get somewhere safe." Zhao Wei didn't know whether to feel relief or more fear. Whatever was coming, she was now in the thick of it. The man's hand reached down and pressed a button on the dashboard. A small compartment opened, revealing a sleek black tablet. He tapped something on it quickly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the screen. "There's no time to waste," he muttered under his breath, as the vehicle sped through the streets with renewed urgency. Zhao Wei leaned forward, unable to ignore the growing sense of dread in her chest. There was no turning back now. Whatever had started with her husband, whatever secrets he had been hiding, had just pulled her into a world far more dangerous than she ever imagined. And as the miles ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The car sped through the night, the road stretching out endlessly before them. The weight of the man's words pressed heavily on Zhao Wei's chest. She wasn't sure whether she was more terrified of the unknown or the feeling that she was already too deep into something she couldn't escape. The man glanced at her once more, his face hard and unreadable. But there was something else in his eyes, something that suggested he had seen horrors far worse than what she had experienced. "Where are we going?" Zhao Wei asked, her voice tight with fear. She needed to know. She couldn't just follow blindly into the dark. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering to the road ahead. "A safe house. A place where they can't find us." "Not yet." Zhao Wei's mind raced. Safe house? Who was this man? And who was they? Whoever had orchestrated her husband's death, whoever had tried to kill her, was still out there, and she had no idea how much time she had left before they came for her again. "Who are they?" She pressed again, her voice breaking slightly. "Why are they after me?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road with a laser-like focus. "They're a group. Dangerous," he said finally, his voice low. "They deal in power, secrets, control. Your husband was mixed up with them, and you, by extension, are too." Zhao Wei's stomach twisted. She couldn't grasp the enormity of what he was saying. Her husband, the man she had loved, the one who had always seemed so ordinary. Asterisk-y asterisk was involved in something like this? "Why didn't I know?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Why didn't he tell me?" The man's expression softened just slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because it's dangerous. He wanted to protect you, even if it meant keeping you in the dark. But he couldn't stop what was coming. No one can." Zhao Wei's hands clenched into fists in her lap, her breath coming in shallow bursts. There was so much she didn't know, so much that had been hidden from her. Her mind wandered back to that night, to the figure in the study, the one who had nearly killed her. What had they meant when they said she was guilty? What had they been talking about? She had to know. She needed to know the truth. "What did they mean when they said I was guilty?" she asked, her voice shaking with the weight of her fear. The man glanced at her again, his eyes narrowing. "You're not guilty," he said, his voice firm. "But your husband, he made decisions. Dangerous ones. And now you're a part of that. Whether you like it or not." Her heart pounded in her chest, the confusion only deepening. She wasn't guilty? Then why was she involved? Why was her life hanging by a thread? The car slowed suddenly, and Zhao Wei snapped out of her spiraling thoughts. The headlights of the vehicle illuminated a small, isolated house ahead. It wasn't much, just a modest cottage tucked into the shadows of the trees. "Stay here," the man ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative. He pulled the car to a stop and turned off the engine, his eyes scanning the area once more. Zhao Wei's pulse quickened as the man opened the door and stepped out, his movements purposeful and quiet. She hesitated for only a moment before following him. She couldn't stay in the car forever. Whatever lay ahead, she was in this now. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. They walked toward the house, the silence between them heavy and thick with the unspoken. The man unlocked the door with a swift motion, pushing it open and stepping inside. Zhao Wei's body was still bound to the chair, but her mind raced. Was this figure afraid of the man, or was it trying to manipulate him? The man took another step forward, his stance unyielding. "I understand more than you think. You've taken too much from too many people." The figure's head lowered, a bitter laugh escaping its lips, low and mocking. "You really think you can stop this? You think you can stop me?" For the first time, Zhao Wei saw the fear in the figure's eyes. It was as if the truth was too much for it to bear. The power it had wielded so effortlessly was slipping away. "You're wrong," the figure muttered, voice breaking. "You think you know what's coming, but you have no idea." The man's eyes narrowed. "I've seen enough." You've hurt enough people. He reached for something at his waist, pulling out a gun, its cold steel gleaming under the faint light. The figure's eyes widened, but it didn't move. It had no choice now but to face the consequences of its actions. The power was gone. The room was theirs. Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who this man was, but he wasn't afraid. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't afraid either. The gun was pointed directly at the figure now. It took a slow step back, its eyes flickering to the shadows, as if searching for a way out that didn't exist. "Who are you?" Zhao Wei's voice cracked, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. The man didn't take his eyes off the figure, but he answered her. "I'm someone who's been watching, waiting for the right moment." The figure laughed again, this time bitter and hollow. "You think you've won? You think you've stopped me? This isn't over." But the man was already walking toward Zhao Wei, not sparing the figure another glance. His hand moved quickly, cutting the ropes, binding her to the chair. Zhao Wei's arms ached as they were freed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this wasn't the end. The man didn't look at her as he helped her to her feet, but his presence was like a shield, a barrier between her and the horror that had unfolded in this house. "I'll explain everything," he said, his voice calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "But we need to get out of here. Now." Zhao Wei nodded, though her thoughts were a tangled mess. Who was this man? What had she just witnessed? And most importantly, what had she stumbled into that had led to her husband's death, her own near demise, and this strange man's intervention? The man's hand gripped hers firmly, pulling her toward the door. Zhao Wei looked back at the motionless figure on the floor. Was it truly over? Or had the real nightmare only just begun? The man's grip tightened on her hand as they moved swiftly through the dark, narrow hallway. Zhao Wei's mind was still reeling from the chaos of the past moments. Her husband's death, the sinister figure, and now, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, saving her from an unknown fate. They reached the front door, and the man didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he yanked it open, the heavy wooden door groaning in protest. Zhao Wei squinted against the harsh light of the moon outside. The cold night air hit her skin, but it didn't feel as biting as it had before. In that moment, it was a reminder that she was alive, that she had escaped whatever fate the figure had planned for her. But how long would that freedom last? The man pulled her out into the yard, his movements quick, decisive. He glanced over his shoulder once, as if expecting something or someone to follow. Zhao Wei barely had time to take in her surroundings. The mansion loomed behind them, dark and imposing, its windows like eyes staring back at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something watching them. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the perimeter, every shadow, every rustling branch. Then, finally, he turned to her. "Somewhere safe," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "We don't have much time." Zhao Wei nodded, too shaken to argue. She had no choice but to trust him, at least for now. He led her through the garden, his pace quick but measured. The house behind them seemed to grow smaller, but its ominous presence still clung to the air like a dark cloud. They reached a black SUV parked at the edge of the property, its engine already running, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The man opened the door for her, his eyes never leaving the shadows. Zhao Wei slid into the passenger seat, her mind whirling. She glanced back at the house one last time before the door slammed shut, sealing her fate for the moment. As they pulled away, the man glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, his voice softer now, but still laced with that urgency. "But you're in danger. You need to understand that." Zhao Wei swallowed hard, her throat dry. What's going on? Who were they? And who are you? The man exhaled, his grip tightening on the wheel. I'll explain everything once we're safe. But right now, all you need to know is that your life, everything you thought you knew, has just changed. Her pulse quickened. She leaned back in the seat, staring at the dark road ahead. Was she truly safe now? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse? The darkness ahead seemed to stretch on forever, an endless road leading into the unknown. And for the first time, Zhao Wei realized that she had no idea where this road would take her. The car sped through the empty streets, the night swallowing the world outside the windows. Zhao Wei sat in silence, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Every question she had swirled in her head, unanswered, as she tried to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded. The man beside her didn't speak again. His focus was fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Zhao Wei glanced at him, studying his face for any hint of what was really going on. His sharp features were impassive, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if expecting someone to be following them. She finally broke the silence. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time, yet firm with the need for answers. The man didn't look at her, but he replied after a long pause. "A friend." Zhao Wei's eyes narrowed. "A friend? You expect me to believe that?" He sighed, the sound deep and weary. "You're not in a position to question me right now." His words stung, but Zhao Wei knew he was right. There was no room for defiance in this moment, not with everything at stake. She glanced out the window again, the dark landscape flashing by, but her thoughts couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was still out there. The figure, the one who had attacked her, hadn't seemed like a mere human. It had felt different, dangerous. But this man, he seemed like the only one who could protect her, even if she didn't fully understand why. "Why did they want me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best effort to stay calm. "What do they want from me?" The man's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror once more. Zhao Wei hesitated before following him into the dimly lit room. The air inside was cool and musty, the scent of old wood and damp earth hanging in the air. The man turned to her. "We're safe for now." Zhao Wei nodded, but something gnawed at her insides. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a temporary refuge, that the storm was still out there waiting. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do next?" The man looked at her with a mixture of determination and resignation. "Now, we find out who you really are." The words sent a chill down her spine. Who you really are, what did that mean? What truth had she yet to uncover about herself? Before she could ask more, the man's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen, his face tightening. "We've got company," he muttered under his breath. Zhao Wei's stomach dropped. And just like that, she realized her nightmare wasn't over. It was only beginning. The man's grip on the phone tightened, his eyes scanning the room quickly, his every movement sharp and precise. Zhao Wei's heart began to race again, her pulse quickening in time with the dread that seemed to claw its way up her throat. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Now." Before she could ask another question, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the house. The small, quiet space now felt suffocating. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light from the corner of the room seemed to echo louder than ever. "Who's coming?" Zhao Wei's voice was barely a whisper, the uncertainty in her chest rising with each passing second. The man didn't answer immediately, his gaze locked on the door as if waiting for it to burst open. Then, in one swift motion, he shoved open a door leading to a small, narrow hallway at the back of the house. "We don't have much time," he said again, more forcefully this time. Zhao Wei stumbled as he dragged her down the hallway, her thoughts a blur. The world felt too fast. She could barely keep up with the pace. The confusion, the fear, it all blurred together as she tried to make sense of the situation. The man stopped suddenly at a door at the end of the hall and turned to face her. "Listen to me," he said, his voice unusually calm. "Whatever happens, stay here. Don't open the door for anyone. Do you understand?" Zhao Wei nodded, her mind still spinning. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know who was coming for them or why they were after her. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just some random act of violence anymore. This was something much bigger, and she was caught in the middle of it. The man hesitated for a moment, as if about to say something else. Then he turned, disappearing down the hallway without another word. Zhao Wei stood in the doorway, staring after him, her breath shallow. Every instinct in her told her to follow him, to demand answers. But the fear in his eyes, something she had rarely seen in someone so controlled, held her in place. The sound of footsteps grew louder, nearing the door. Zhao Wei's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. Who was coming? The footsteps stopped, just outside the door. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She could hear the sound of a low voice, someone speaking in hushed tones, too muffled for her to make out the words. Suddenly, the door handle jiggled. Zhao Wei's stomach dropped and her body tensed. Her first instinct was to run, but she had nowhere to go. The man had told her to stay here. But what if he didn't come back? What if this was all a trap? The door handle turned slowly. Zhao Wei's breath hitched. Was it him? Or someone else? The door creaked open. Her eyes went wide, her heart hammering in her chest. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway behind them. It wasn't the man who had been helping her. It wasn't anyone she had expected. It was the hooded figure, the one who had attacked her before. And in that moment, Zhao Wei understood. The nightmare wasn't just following her. It had already found her again. The hooded figure stood in the doorway, its presence heavy, as if the very air had thickened with dread. Zhao Wei froze, her mind scrambling to make sense of the impossible situation. The figure didn't move, its silhouette a dark shape against the dim light. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The space between them stretched and tense, filled with unspoken danger. Then, with a sharp movement, the figure pushed the door open wider, stepping into the room. Zhao Wei's heart pounded in her chest, her limbs frozen in terror. She didn't know what to do, didn't know if she should run, hide, or try to fight. She could feel her breath catching in her throat as the figure took a step forward. "You," she whispered, barely able to form the word. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if studying her. Then it spoke, its voice low and cold. "You really think you can escape?" Zhao Wei's blood ran cold at the words. She couldn't understand. Why was it here? Why wasn't it with the man who had promised to protect her? "No," her voice trembled. "What do you want from me?" The figure's eyes gleamed beneath the shadow of the hood. It took another step forward, moving with a chilling calmness. "What I want. You're the one who doesn't understand, Zhao Wei. You're already part of this game, and you can't escape it." Zhao Wei's mind reeled, the words tumbling through her thoughts in a haze. What game? What was this figure talking about? What did it want with her? "You're not a victim here," the figure continued, its voice seeping into the room like poison. "You were always meant to be here. Your husband knew it. And now, so do you..." Her body tensed. Her husband. What had he known? What was she supposed to understand? Why had he hidden everything from her? The figure moved closer still, its presence oppressive, like the walls of the room were closing in on her. "You're not ready to know everything yet," it whispered, almost soothingly. "But you will be, soon." The words sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if the figure could read her thoughts. its voice a strange comfort and terror all at once. Zhao Wei stepped back instinctively, her heart hammering. The door behind her was still ajar, the darkness of the hallway now seeming miles away, unreachable. Who are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice hoarse. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it reached up slowly, pulling the hood back from its face. Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man who had helped her, the man who had claimed he was trying to protect her. But now his eyes, those same cold, calculating eyes, were filled with something else, something darker, a knowing look that sent a chill deep into her bones. "You," Zhao Wei whispered, unable to comprehend. "But why are you doing this?" The figure, smiled faintly, a sadistic twist on his lips. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "I told you we were both caught up in this, but you thought I was the one trying to save you. No, Zhao Wei, you were never meant to be saved." She took another step back, her legs trembling. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were suffocating her, closing in on her very breath. "No," she gasped, her mind reeling. "No, this can't be true." But the man stepped forward, his expression colder than ever. "It's all part of the plan. Your husband, me, you. None of us had a choice." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a twisted game, a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Zhao Wei's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, the desperation in her voice now matching the terror in her chest. The man smiled again, his eyes dark, with something unreadable. "I told you. You'll understand soon enough." He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in her ears, and for a moment, Zhao Wei was sure her legs would give out beneath her. But she refused to break. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. The man's smile faded, replaced by something far more dangerous. "You don't have a choice." In that instant, Zhao Wei felt the weight of the situation, the absolute helplessness that pressed in on her. She was trapped. And she knew this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for her very soul. The hooded figure stood in the doorway, its presence heavy, as if the very air had thickened with dread. Zhao Wei froze, her mind scrambling to make sense of the impossible situation. The figure didn't move, its silhouette a dark shape against the dim light. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The space between them stretched and tense, filled with unspoken danger. Then, with a sharp movement, the figure pushed the door open wider, stepping into the room. Zhao Wei's heart pounded in her chest, her limbs frozen in terror. She didn't know what to do, didn't know if she should run, hide, or try to fight. She could feel her breath catching in her throat as the figure took a step forward. "You," she whispered, barely able to form the word. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if studying her. Then it spoke, its voice low and cold. "You really think you can escape?" Zhao Wei's blood ran cold at the words. She couldn't understand. Why was it here? Why wasn't it with the man who had promised to protect her? "No," her voice trembled. "What do you want from me?" The figure's eyes gleamed beneath the shadow of the hood. It took another step forward, moving with a chilling calmness. "What I want? You're the one who doesn't understand, Zhao Wei. You're already part of this game, and you can't escape it." Zhao Wei's mind reeled, the words tumbling through her thoughts in a haze. What game? What was this figure talking about? What did it want with her? "You're not a victim here," the figure continued, its voice seeping into the room like poison. "You were always meant to be here. Your husband knew it, and now, so do you." Her body tensed. Her husband. What had he known? What was she supposed to understand? Why had he hidden everything from her? The figure moved closer still, its presence oppressive, like the walls of the room were closing in on her. "You're not ready to know everything yet," it whispered, almost soothingly. "But you will be, soon." The words sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if the figure could read her thoughts, its voice a strange comfort and terror all at once. Zhao Wei stepped back instinctively, her heart hammering. The door behind her was still ajar, the darkness of the hallway now seeming miles away, unreachable. Who are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice hoarse. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it reached up slowly, pulling the hood back from its face. Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man who had helped her, the man who had claimed he was trying to protect her. But now his eyes, those same cold, calculating eyes, were filled with something else. Something darker. A knowing look that sent a chill deep into her bones. "You," Zhao Wei whispered, unable to comprehend. "But why are you doing this?" The figure, smiled faintly, a sadistic twist on his lips. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "I told you we were both caught up in this, but you thought I was the one trying to save you. No, Zhao Wei, you were never meant to be saved." She took another step back, her legs trembling. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were suffocating her, closing in on her very breath. "No," she gasped, her mind reeling. "No, this can't be true." But the man stepped forward, his expression colder than ever. "It's all part of the plan. Your husband, you. None of us had a choice." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a twisted game, a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Zhao Wei's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, the desperation in her voice now matching the terror in her chest. The man smiled again, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "I told you. You'll understand soon enough." He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in her ears, and for a moment, Zhao Wei was sure her legs would give out beneath her. But she refused to break. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. The man's smile faded, replaced by something far more dangerous. "You don't have a choice." In that instant, Zhao Wei felt the weight of the situation, the absolute helplessness that pressed in on her. She was trapped, and she knew. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for her very soul. The room seemed to shrink with every breath Zhao Wei took, her body tensing as the man closed the distance between them. The air felt heavier, like the very walls were closing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of the truth she couldn't quite grasp. "You think you can run from this?" The man's voice was barely a whisper now, but it was laced with venom. "You were already marked the moment you stepped into this world." Zhao Wei's mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to think. She couldn't just let him take her. But where could she go? The door was too far. Her legs felt like lead. "Why?" she choked out, her voice trembling. "Why me? What did I ever do to deserve this?" The man stopped in front of her, towering over her with a look of cold detachment. "It's not about what you did. It's about what you are. You're the key to all of this." Zhao Wei. His words sent a shock through her, her blood running cold. The key? What could he possibly mean by that? "You really don't remember, do you?" The man's voice grew low, almost regretful. "You're the missing piece. Everything that's been happening, it's all connected to you." Zhao Wei's mind was spinning. The missing piece. The more he spoke, the more her confusion deepened. Her breath caught as the memories began to resurface, fragments of her past that had been locked away, buried deep inside. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's impossible." The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You don't remember what your husband was really doing, do you? All those meetings, the strange phone calls, the debts, the deals. You thought he was just a businessman, didn't you? that he was just keeping secrets for the sake of money. Her stomach twisted. Was that it? Was that why he had always been so distant, so secretive? But then, a darker thought crept into her mind. Was he involved in something far worse than money? The man stepped closer, leaning in as if to whisper a terrible truth into her ear. The truth, Zhao Wei, is that you've been living a lie. Your husband wasn't just making deals, he was part of a network, a powerful one. And you? You were born into this. Her breath hitched, and she staggered backward. No, she gasped, unable to believe his words. That can't be true. Don't be naive. His voice was hard now, devoid of the compassion he'd once shown. You have no idea how deep this runs, how far it goes. You were always meant to be part of it. And now that you're here, there's no going back. Zhao Wei's legs felt weak, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. She couldn't grasp the enormity of what he was saying. She couldn't believe it. Born into this. What did he mean? But even as she tried to make sense of it, a cold realization settled in her chest. Her husband's sudden death, the attacks on her life, it wasn't random. It wasn't just the work of some criminal underworld. It had all been orchestrated. She was a pawn, a piece in a game she never knew existed. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. The door to the hallway creaked open. Zhao Wei spun around, her breath catching in her throat. A second figure stood there, silhouetted in the darkness, just as silent, just as menacing. Her heart sank. There was no way out. The man behind her didn't flinch, his expression unchanged. "We'll see how long you last when the truth finally comes crashing down," he said, his voice filled with finality. The second figure stepped forward, revealing a face Zhao Wei had never seen before. A woman, tall and lean, her features sharp, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, even in the dim light. She held something in her hand, a sleek, black device, small enough to be concealed, but powerful enough to end everything. Without a word, the woman advanced, her gaze cold and calculating. Zhao Wei felt a shiver run down her spine. She was cornered. The man's voice sliced through the tension. "You're out of options, Zhao Wei. You've already made your choice." Zhao Wei's mind screamed for an escape, for a way to break free. She didn't know who this woman was, but she could feel the weight of danger in her every step. The figure in front of her, the man, was one thing. But this woman, with her icy resolve, was something else entirely. Desperation clawed at her throat as the woman came closer, her movements deliberate, controlled. Zhao Wei's eyes darted to the window. The street outside was dark, silent. Then, as the woman reached out toward her, something inside Zhao Wei snapped. She didn't know where the strength came from, but in a split second, she made a decision. She ran. Her legs carried her toward the door with an instinct she couldn't suppress. She didn't know what lay beyond, but she had to get away. She didn't look back. Zhao Wei's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she bolted from the room, her heart pounding against her ribcage. Her body moved on pure adrenaline, her mind too overwhelmed to fully comprehend the decision she had made. She didn't look back. Every step forward was a desperate escape, an attempt to outrun the terror, closing in on her. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, her feet echoing loudly in the silence. Behind her, she could hear the man's voice, calm and cold. "You can't outrun this, Zhao Wei." But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The words were like knives, slicing through her resolve. But she pressed on, her eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hallway, the only possible way out. The door slammed open with a force that rattled her bones. She stepped into the night, the cold air biting her skin as she found herself in an overgrown garden. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, dark shadows looming like watchful eyes, but she didn't care. She needed to get away. Her breath fogged in the chilly night air as she ran across the garden, her feet heavy against the wet grass. The gate. She had to find the gate. There had to be a way out. But then, as she neared the corner of the garden, a voice called from behind her. "Don't make this harder on yourself, Zhao Wei." The words froze her in place, her body instinctively stiffening. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness, trying to spot the source of the voice. The figure emerged from the shadows. The woman with the dark sunglasses was walking toward her, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. "You're not going anywhere," the woman said flatly, as if stating a fact, not a threat. Zhao Wei's stomach churned, panic rising in her chest. She looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to go. With a sudden movement, the woman raised her hand, revealing the small device she'd been holding. Zhao Wei's eyes widened as she recognized the faint hum coming from it, the unmistakable sound of a tranquilizer dart charging. Her feet were frozen in place, her mind scrambling to find an escape. And then, in the silence of the night, the world around her seemed to slow, as if time itself was holding its breath. The woman took another step, the device aimed squarely at her. Zhao Wei had no choice. She turned and ran, her legs burning as she pushed her body faster than ever before, willing herself to escape. But it was too late. The sharp hiss of the dart broke through the air. It struck her in the shoulder with a sudden, searing pain. Her legs buckled beneath her. The world spun, her vision fading in and out as the darkness claimed her. The last thing she remembered was the cold night air and the sound of her heart pounding in her ears. And then everything went black. When she woke, she was no longer outside. She was in a dimly lit room, lying on a cold metal table. The pain in her shoulder had dulled, but the terror in her chest had only intensified. She was trapped. And this time, there would be no escape. Zhao Wei's eyelids fluttered open, the faint light in the room blurring around her. Her head throbbed, the remnants of the tranquilizer still pulling at her consciousness. She felt a chill creep over her skin as she tried to sit up, but the cold, hard metal beneath her held her in place. The room was stark empty, save for the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. The walls were bare, and the air smelled sterile, devoid of any comfort. Panic slowly seeped in, but she fought it back, refusing to let it take control. She tried to remember how she'd ended up here. The garden, the woman with the device, the dart. It all came rushing back in disjointed flashes, a blur of motion and fear. Her throat was dry, but she managed to swallow, the sound of her own breath echoing in the silence. A door opened somewhere to her left, and Zhao Wei's body stiffened instinctively. A figure stepped into the room, their silhouette cutting through the dimness like a shadow. It was the man, the one who had once claimed to be her protector. He stood at the threshold, his face unreadable, the same cold expression she had seen before. "Zhao Wei," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I'm sorry it had to come to this." She stared at him, her mind too clouded by the drug to form coherent thoughts, but the words hit her like a wave. Sorry, he had been the one to lead her here, the one who had played her like a puppet in a game she never understood. "You've known all along, haven't you?" she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "All this time, I was just part of your plan." His eyes softened for a fleeting moment, but the hardness returned just as quickly. "It was never personal. You were always meant to be here, Zhao Wei." She shook her head, disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "Meant to be here?" A cold laugh escaped her lips, bitter and defeated. "I never asked for this. I never asked for any of it." The man didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward her slowly, his footsteps soft but resolute. "It doesn't matter now," he said quietly, standing over her. "This is how it ends." Zhao Wei's breath caught in her throat as a realization settled over her. There would be no dramatic escape, no heroic showdown. There was only the cold reality of her situation. And then, with a final, lingering look, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the sterile silence. The door clicked shut, and the darkness rushed in to fill the space. Zhao Wei was left to face the truth. There was no way out. Not this time. The world she had known, the fame, the riches, the promises of love and safety, had all been a facade. In the end, it was all part of a much darker design. And now, she was nothing more than a piece in a game that had no winners. She closed her eyes, the weight of her fate pressing down on her, and in the quiet, she let go.